You're listening to World War II, Above and Below. Hello everyone and welcome to World War II, Above and Below. The video version of this podcast on YouTube includes historical photographs and footage of the 78th Fighter Group, mixed in with gameplay video from IL-2 Sturmovik Great Battles, a World War II combat flight simulator. The gameplay footage is my friends and I flying Mustangs and Thunderbolts painted up in the markings of the 78th Fighter Group. Unfortunately, there are very few which feature invasion stripes, which is pretty sacrilegious for an episode about D-Day. For those unfamiliar with invasion stripes, that's the black and white paint which was applied to Allied aircraft to help aid with recognition from the ground. I also apologize in advance for my American pronunciations of these European villages and towns, so please feel free to correct me in the comments. For those interested in my research, check the description of the YouTube upload. To help with visual context, you'll see video I shot in Normandy during a trip there in 2022, as well as some additional World War II footage. With that bit of housekeeping done, let's get to it. World War II, Above and Below presents stories of the 78th Fighter Group. Episode 3, The Great Crusade. In May 1944, just weeks leading up to D-Day, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, had to narrow down what would become the precise time and day for Operation Overlord. At the same time, 8th Air Force planners were also making some changes. Bomber crews and fighter pilots saw a mandatory extension of tour completion requirements. The 8th Bomber Command raised its required mission total of 25 missions to 30, and then 35 by the midsummer of 1944. The 8th Fighter Command increased the combat hours requirement from 200 to 300 hours. From what I can tell in my research, this also applied to the 9th Air Force bomber and fighter groups as well. There must have been reluctance on behalf of Allied air leaders to issue these orders. It is understandable, though, as to why it was happening. The invasion had to succeed, and part of ensuring that success was to keep experienced flyers in the air as long as they could. While I do not have an exact number, there are many pilots and air crewmen who signed up for a second tour, and the 78th had several cases of this. Along with additional tour requirements, the 78th began flying fighter-bomber missions in late May. These low-altitude runs consisted of strafing and bombing enemy assets in tactical nature, troop and vehicle convoys, flak batteries, radar sites, marshalling yards, communications centers, gun emplacements, and so on. Anything that supported the Nazi war effort was deemed a target of opportunity. Eliminating these communication and supply lines would expedite the Allied breakout from Normandy later that summer. With an invasion date nearing, fighter-bomber missions increased, and Nazi flak was almost always a problem on these runs. Being hit at low altitude was virtually a death sentence. And despite the Allies gaining air superiority by this stage in the war, low-altitude air battles with German fighters over France would cost the lives of several 78th pilots in June 1944. 2 days before the invasion of Normandy on June 4th, tragedy struck the 78th Fighter Group in another instance of seemingly hard luck. Captain James Wilkinson, a seasoned pilot and fighter ace, flew to South Wales for a Royal Air Force requested demonstration of strafing tactics on locomotives. Poor visibility caused Wilkinson to crash into a mountainside later on that day. Frida Sutton, Wilkinson's widow, an Englishwoman he had met while overseas, was presented with his awards at his funeral a few days later. She committed suicide at the age of 34 on January 12, 1945. The day after Captain Wilkinson's unexpected death, Second Lieutenant John Steinwedel also found himself in bad weather when his P-47 iced up at 16,000 feet on an escort mission over Amiens, France. Steinwedel bailed out over Mons, Belgium, possibly due to a navigation error. His P-47 crashed into a house while he came down on top of another building. An eyewitness report from a Mons citizen recalls the following. The aviator managed to get to the chimney, and holding himself with one hand, he made a sign of surrender with the other, while some 20 German soldiers and a couple of civilians were watching. One of the soldiers shot him down. Steinwedel fell some 10 meters down at the rear of the house at number 6. He was carried away by the Germans and died at the German military hospital located at Jemappes. End quote. The article featuring this story can be found in the description, and I have a few other points to add that aren't in the article, probably because the information wasn't available to the writer at the time. The soldier who fatally shot Steinwedel is named in the article as Gustav Karl Rüster, and he was later charged with war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging for his actions in July 1947. I looked up his name, and it turns out that Rüster was actually a German railroad worker of the Reichsbahn. He was tried in Dachau at the General Military Government Court, where the findings and sentence were disapproved because of insufficiency of evidence. 64 years after his death, John Steinwedel was forever memorialized by the citizens of Mons, who placed a plaque on the building where he landed. A U.S. Air Force color guard was also present for the ceremony, and pictures of this can be seen in a link to the article about this incident.
General Eisenhower's order of the day was distributed to every man on board the invading armada. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory.
When D-Day arrived, all the crew chiefs were issued a Thompson submachine gun and a .45 caliber pistol. You wore your pistol all the time on the flight line and kept the machine gun close by. We were also required to pull guard duty on our own aircraft at night for a period of time. This meant 24-hour duty a day. Staff Sergeant James Tudor, Crew Chief, 78th Fighter Group. On June 6, 1944, between the hours of 3:23 a.m. and 11:15 p.m., the 78th Fighter Group had flown 5 combat missions over Normandy. The D-Day orders to air units from SHAEF were to keep planes in the sky until the designated landing beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword were secured. The 78th started off by flying over Cherbourg, a coastal city in Normandy that held the only deep-water port on the Cotentin Peninsula. On another mission later in the afternoon, the Duxford Eagles ran rampant over the marshalling yards at Alencon, where they destroyed dozens of train cars filled with materiel, 2 locomotives, and at least 10 flat cars carrying vehicles. The only aerial sparring took place on the third mission. The Thunderbolts, led by Colonel Fred Gray, bounced 8 FW-190s and downed 2 for no losses. The sun had set by 18:22 hours when the 78th took off for its last mission on D-Day. When no enemy aircraft were found during their combat air patrol, the Duxford Eagles hit the deck and shot up a fuel train to end the evening. It is during this action that the 78th suffered its only loss on D-Day. Second Lieutenant Wallace Haley's P-47 was so damaged by the fuel train exploding that he was forced to ditch in the English Channel and was later picked up by Air Sea Rescue. By the time the last Thunderbolt touched down at Duxford, the Allies had secured all 5 landing beaches and were pushing inland. Poor weather did not stop the Allied airmen from flying missions in the days that followed June 6th. In fact, The 78th flew missions on 25 of the 30 days in June. 14 of these consisted of flying multiple combat missions in a single day. The exact number of missions I have been able to locate for June seems to be 45. This is also the same number that author and historian Martin Bowman has in Duxford and the Big Wing. In a month's time, the 78th flew 45 missions. This is the most in a 30-day span during the 2 years they were overseas. Duxford Eagles by Garry provides some telling statistics of how busy June 1944 was for just the 83rd Fighter Squadron. And mind you, this is only accounting for a single squadron in the 78th Fighter Group. 639 aircraft sorties were dispatched, 14 aircraft aborted after takeoff, and 8 failed to take off. To put it into perspective, of those 639 sorties, only 22 aircraft failed to continue with the mission. These impressive numbers reflect the hard work by the ground crews of the 78th to keep these P-47s airborne. Nearly 100,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition had been expended, 78,000 of which were in combat, the rest being used for practice. 79 tons of bombs were dropped. 1,984 total combat hours in the squadron that averaged 78 hours per pilot, and 215,500 gallons of aviation fuel. June 1944 was a very busy time. In September 2022, my wife and I visited Normandy American Cemetery behind Omaha Beach at Coulville-sur-Mer. We went to find the grave of a P-47 pilot in the 9th Air Force from my hometown who was shot down and killed in July 1944. After I found his grave, I started walking through the same plot and came across a man from the 78th Fighter Group buried maybe some 20 to 30 feet away. His name was 2nd Lieutenant Richard Cooner from Connecticut, who was killed in action on June 10, 1944. When I investigated Cooner's information, I had no idea he was one of 10 losses that day for the 78th. It was the worst single day suffered by the group in their 2 years of combat. They had flown 3 fighter bomber missions over France that day on June 10th, and by the end of the evening, 10 pilots were killed, captured, or missing. The first pilot to go down was Lieutenant Robert Baker, who took a flak hit while strafing. Shortly after, Richard Cooner struck either a tree or a telegraph pole while on a bomb run, and he was killed instantly. On the return back to Duxford after the first mission, 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Lloyd landed in a field near the base as a result from flak damage. It is unclear to me if this P-47 was returned to flying status, but I chalk this one up as a loss for June 10th. The second mission saw the 78th bounced by some 20-plus German fighters while they were making a bomb run over Argenton. This engagement is where the 78th suffered most of its losses that day. 7 Thunderbolts were shot down by enemy aircraft in a matter of minutes. Reports indicate that most of this engagement took place at low altitude, while several of the P-47s were still carrying bombs and an external fuel tank. This is from the Escape and Evasion Report of 2nd Lieutenant Robert McIntosh. I finished my bomb run and sighted 20-plus 190s coming down on us. The squadron leader acknowledged my call. I tried to cover him and was waiting for him to break in the gaggle when 2 190s hit me from behind and below. The first 190 clobbered me before I saw him, and overshot when I cut throttle and skidded. Before I could fire on him, his wingman finished me. For those interested, I have included 2 air combat reports, and the escape and evasion reports from the pilots of the June 10, 1944 mission. If you look through these, the enemy aircraft types are disputed, with some pilots saying 20-plus Me-109s, 20-plus FW-190s, or 20 enemy aircraft consisting of FW-190s and Me-109s. Regardless of type, the amount of attacking aircraft is consistent. As best I can tell, almost all of these Thunderbolts were shot down before the squadron providing top cover could get to their aid. Major Harold Stump, along with First Lieutenant James Casey, were taken prisoner. Robert McIntosh and Major Donald McLeod evaded capture and returned to Duxford later in the summer of 1944. Unfortunately, 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Lloyd, 1st Lieutenant Vincent Massa, and Captain William Hunt were killed. There are some mixed accounts in my research, and I've tried to get these as accurate as possible. For example, Major Harold Stump is often listed as killed in action on this mission, when he actually survived and became a prisoner of war. McIntosh is also noted as taken prisoner, but as previously mentioned, he evaded capture. Lieutenant Daniel Lloyd, who already had belly landed near Duxford after the first mission earlier that morning, was presumed to be killed in the engagement over Argenton. However, he was able to once again belly land his shot-up P-47. Only this time it was behind enemy lines, in a field near Bois Arnaud, some 40 miles from Argenton. He was immediately captured by some SS soldiers who executed him. According to an article on the American Air Museum website, the ranking officer of this incident was tried for war crimes in 1948 and hanged. The dogfight over Argenton saw both sides savage each other as the 78th claimed 5 enemy aircraft in exchange for those 7 losses. Like their first mission of the day, another heavily damaged P-47 had to make a belly landing in England, this time along the coast at RAF Manston. Its pilot, Herbert Boyle, was uninjured. The final mission of the day would see one more tragedy, and this time in a non-combat loss. The 78th took off from Duxford in the early evening to bomb an ammo dump at Falaise. As they approached the south coast of England in overcast weather, 2 Thunderbolts collided with each other. Second Lieutenant Francis Kochenek bailed out and suffered only a broken ankle after hitting the ground. Lieutenant William McDermott, trapped inside his aircraft, never made it out. He was Duxford's last casualty of the day. The remaining 28 Thunderbolts of the group made it to Falaise and hit their targets before heading home. The worst day in the history of the 78th Fighter Group was finally over. In the research for this June 10, 1944 mission, it was interesting to see the updated information per sources. Most of the time I stick with the 78th Fighter Group official records such as operational and after-action reports, then check the information to see if any of it was updated in the years following the war. For the June 10th mission, much of what I was familiar with was only the losses over France, and in total that was 10 aircraft shot down and 7 pilots killed. It wasn't until the research material for this episode that I discovered there were more than 10 aircraft lost if you also count the P-47 crash landings near Duxford and at RAF Manston. I bring this up because the 78th effectively lost a squadron of P-47s in a single day with nearly as many pilots. An 8th Air Force fighter squadron was typically made up of 12 to 16 aircraft, for those curious about the numbers, and despite this, the 78th flew 28 more missions between June 11th and 30th. It is my opinion that the June 10th actions by the 78th is the biggest example of fortitude for any 8th Air Force fighter group. They flew multiple missions, hit their targets, suffered heavy losses, and kept going until the day was finished. It is also a reminder that there were 11 more months to go before the fighting in Europe ended. This point is sometimes lost in the contemporary news media during the anniversary of D-Day. When people think of D-Day, the focus is heavily concentrated on just June 6, 1944, which is understandable, and D-Day was certainly a watershed moment for the 78th Fighter Group and their fellow Allied airmen. When the 8th Air Force arrived in England during 1942, they knew that a cross-channel invasion would never succeed without control of the air. When Allied planners decided this would take place in the late spring of 1944, air superiority needed to be achieved in a matter of months. Donald Miller's passage in Masters of the Air best sums up this accomplishment by explaining what led up to D-Day. In the 5-month battle for air supremacy that made the invasion possible, the American air forces in Europe lost over 2,600 heavy bombers and 980 fighter planes and suffered 18,400 casualties, including 10,000 combat deaths, over half as many men as the 8th lost in all of 1942 and 1943. These airmen deserve an equal place in the national memory with the approximately 6,000 American soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in action in the amphibious and airborne assault on D-Day. So let's take a moment to remember all of those brave men and women in the Allied forces who contributed to liberating the continent of Europe over 80 years ago. Tune in next month on July 4th for the next episode of Stories of the 78th Fighter Group. See you next time.